In the old stories of Greenland, the boundary between humans and animals was not always fixed. There is a memory, carried quietly through generations, of a time when people and animals understood one another more deeply, not through words alone, but through shared existence. In Inuit mythology, animals are not symbols, they are persons. Each animal has a soul, awareness, and agency of its own. To hunt was not an act of dominance, but a relationship built on respect, restraint, and gratitude. The seal, the caribou, the whale, and the bear were not seen as lesser beings. They were equals, sometimes older than humans, sometimes wiser. Many stories tell of a time when humans and animals could change forms. A hunter might become a seal beneath the ice. A bear might remove its skin and walk as a human among the people. These stories do not describe magic as spectacle. They describe closeness. They reflect a worldview in which survival depended on understanding animal behavior so deeply that the line between observer and observed became thin. To know an animal was to know how it thought. To respect it was to ensure the balance continued. This balance was fragile. When a hunter took more than was needed or failed to show respect, the consequences followed. Animals would withdraw. Weather would turn harsh. Hunger would arrive. In Inuit stories, these were not punishments from a distant god. They were natural responses to imbalance. The world corrected itself. One of the most important figures in Inuit mythology is Sedna, the sea woman. She is not simply a goddess, but a force of balance. Sedna is said to live beneath the ocean, where she controls the animals of the sea. When humans forget respect, when rules are broken or gratitude is lost, Sedna withholds the animals. The sea becomes empty. Only through ritual, humility, and acknowledgement of wrongdoing can balance be restored. In this way, myth and survival knowledge are woven together. The story teaches behavior. The behavior ensures life. Transformation stories appear again and again in Greenlandic myth. They remind listeners that humans are not separate from nature, but participants within it. In some tales, a human who disrespects animals becomes one. In others, animals choose to help humans, guiding them through storms or ice. These stories reinforce a single idea: survival is relational. The Inuit did not believe the land belonged to people. People belonged to the land. Animals were partners in this relationship, not resources to be exploited without thought. Even death was understood differently. When an animal was killed, its spirit was believed to return to the sea or land, ready to be reborn if treated properly. This belief created restraint. It slowed action. It encouraged care. In the silence of the Arctic, such care was necessary. Mistakes were remembered. Lessons were passed down. And through story, the old world continued to teach the present one. As time passed and conditions changed, the stories adapted, but their core remained the same. Respect ensures balance. Balance ensures survival. In the next chapter, we will move deeper into the unseen world of Inuit belief, to the spirits, the rules that govern them, and the consequences of ignoring what cannot be seen. For now, we remain here, in a time when humans and animals still understood one another, and the world listened closely to how people behaved. Before there were maps of the Arctic, before the name Greenland was written by foreign hands, before ice and sea were measured and divided, there were stories. In the far north, where the land meets the frozen ocean and the sky feels close enough to touch, knowledge was not written down. It was spoken. It was remembered. It was carried from one generation to the next through voice, breath, and careful listening. Among the Inuit of Greenland, these stories were not entertainment. They were memory. They were instruction. They were a way of understanding a land that could give life or take it away without warning. In the old ways, to survive was to remember. The Inuit did not see the world as separate pieces of land, sea, sky, and spirit. Everything was connected. Animals, people, weather, and the unseen forces behind them were part of the same living system. The stories reflect this. They do not begin with the creation of the universe in a single moment. They begin with relationships between people and animals, between the living and the unseen, between the land as it was and the land as it became. In these myths, the past is not a distant, unreachable place. It is close. It lingers beneath the ice, in the wind, in the behavior of animals, and in the shape of the land itself. Some stories speak of a time before the people of today, a time when others lived in the north. They are remembered quietly, without great monuments or written records. The Inuit spoke of them as the Tuniat, a people said to be strong, reserved, and different. They lived simply, moved silently, and left behind traces that were already ancient when the ancestors of today arrived. Whether these stories reflect real encounters, inherited memory, or symbolic teaching is not fully known. What matters is that the memory exists. The land remembers. In the Inuit worldview, the past does not vanish. It settles into the landscape. It becomes part of the terrain itself. Mountains are not just stone. Ice is not just frozen water. Certain places are known to hold stories, even if no one speaks them aloud. Some areas were approached carefully. Others were avoided entirely, not because they were cursed, but because they were powerful. In the old stories, power was not always something to seek. Sometimes it was something to respect from a distance. The Inuit believed that the world had layers, not layers of time, but layers of existence. Above was the sky world, home to celestial beings and forces that shaped weather and fate. Below was the underworld, often described as a place where souls traveled after death. And between them was the human world, fragile, temporary, and deeply dependent on balance. Balance was everything. When balance was broken, the consequences were not abstract. Hunger followed, storms worsened, animals disappeared. The stories warned against arrogance. They warned against forgetting one's place within the world. In many myths, humans who disrespected animals were punished, not out of cruelty, but as correction. Animals were not lesser beings. They were equals, sometimes teachers, sometimes ancestors. In some stories, humans and animals were once able to change forms freely. A person could become a seal. A bear could become a human. These transformations speak to a time when boundaries were not as fixed as they are now, a time when the world was still settling into its present shape. This does not mean the Inuit believed the world was once physically different in a geological sense. Rather, it reflects a worldview where identity, form, and role were fluid. The old world in Inuit myth is not a lost civilization in the modern sense. It is a remembered way of being, a way of living closer to the rhythms of the land, a way of understanding nature as alive, aware, and responsive. As generations passed, the climate changed, ice patterns shifted, new people arrived, old knowledge adapted. The stories changed slightly, but their core remained. They continued to teach humility. They continued to teach respect. They continued to teach survival, and most importantly, they taught that forgetting is dangerous. To forget the stories was to forget how to live in the North. Even today, many of these myths are still told, sometimes openly, sometimes only within families. They are not frozen in the past. They evolve, just as the land does. What we explore in this journey is not a single, fixed mythology. It is a living tradition shaped by ice, wind, memory, and time. In the next chapter, we will begin with one of the most powerful themes in Greenlandic Inuit myth, the relationship between humans and animals, and what happens when that relationship is broken. For now, we remain here, in the quiet beginning, where the North listens, and the old stories wait to be remembered. In the old stories of Greenland, not everything that mattered could be seen. Beyond the animals, the land, and the sky, there existed another layer of the world, a realm of spirits, forces, and presences that shaped daily life in quiet but powerful ways. These were not distant gods. They were close. They lived in the wind, in the sea, in the ice, and in the spaces between people. To live in the North was to live with constant awareness of what could not be seen, but could always be felt. The Inuit believed that the world was governed by rules that were not written down. They were learned through experience, through story, and through careful observation. These rules were known as taboos. Taboos were not arbitrary. They existed to preserve balance between people and animals, between the living and the dead, between the seen and the unseen. Breaking a taboo did not bring punishment in the way modern law does. Instead, it disrupted harmony. When harmony was broken, the effects appeared naturally. Storms grew stronger, hunting failed, illness spread. In this way, cause and consequence were woven into the fabric of the world itself. Many taboos centered around hunting and death. Certain animals could not be hunted together. Specific actions were required after a kill. Tools used for land animals were kept separate from those used for sea animals. These practices were not superstition. They reflected a deep understanding of the rhythms of nature and the need for order in a harsh environment. The unseen world was also inhabited by spirits, some helpful, some indifferent, and some dangerous. Not all spirits were feared. Some were guardians of places or animals. Others were the souls of the dead, lingering close to the living. The boundary between life and death was not absolute. Those who had passed were believed to continue influencing the world, especially if rituals were neglected. Because of this, death required care. Names were reused. Children were sometimes given the names of deceased relatives, believed to carry aspects of their spirit forward. This practice reinforced continuity rather than finality. Life did not end. It changed form. Among the most important figures who mediated between the human and spirit worlds was the Angakuk, often described as a shaman. The Angakuk was not a ruler or priest. They were a guide. Their role was to restore balance when it was lost, to communicate with spirits, uncover the cause of misfortune, and guide the community back into harmony. In times of scarcity or sickness, the Angakuk would journey into the unseen world, sometimes through trance or ritual, to seek understanding. These journeys were not taken lightly. They required discipline, knowledge, and respect. The unseen world was powerful, but it was not chaotic. It followed its own logic, one that could be learned but never controlled. Fear had its place in Inuit mythology, but it was not the dominant force. Respect was. Those who acknowledged the unseen and lived carefully were protected by balance. Those who ignored it risked isolation from the world around them. In this way, Inuit myths reinforced attentiveness. They taught people to watch, to listen, and to act with intention. Nothing was done without thought. Nothing was taken without consequence. As the land changed and the people adapted, these unseen rules remained constant. They shaped behavior quietly, invisibly, but completely. In the next chapter, we will explore the beings that lived at the edges of these rules. Figures remembered not as monsters, but as warnings, and what they reveal about fear, survival, and memory in the Arctic. For now, the unseen remains just beyond the edge of awareness, present in every breath of wind and every choice made in the north. In the old stories of Greenland, not all beings were gentle teachers. Some existed at the edges of the world, where ice met darkness, where hunger weakened judgment, and where silence made small mistakes dangerous. These beings were not imagined to entertain. They were remembered because they served a purpose. They were warnings. In Inuit mythology, fear was not something to be avoided or suppressed. It was something to be understood. The Arctic did not forgive carelessness. To wander alone, to ignore the signs of weather, or to approach the sea without caution could mean death. The stories reflected this truth plainly. One of the most widely remembered figures in Greenlandic and Arctic Inuit tradition is the Kalupiluk. The Kalupiluk was said to live beneath the ice, near cracks in frozen water and the edges of open sea. It was often described as human-like, with long hair that floated beneath the surface and pale skin that blended with the ice. Sometimes it was said to wear animal skins. Sometimes it was said to hum softly or cry like a child. Its purpose was clear. The Kalupiluk warned people, especially children, to stay away from thin ice, to avoid wandering too close to the sea when alone, to respect the places where ice could suddenly give way. Those who ignored the warning were said to be taken beneath the ice, pulled into the freezing water below, never to return. This was not a story of cruelty. It was a story of survival. In a land where falling through ice was one of the most common and deadly dangers, memory needed a shape. The Kalupiluk gave that danger a form that could be remembered. Another being remembered in Greenlandic Inuit stories is the Ijurak. The Ijurak was known as a shapeshifter. It often appeared human at a distance, standing upright, moving in familiar ways. But when approached, something was always wrong. Its eyes were said to be unfocused or mismatched, its movements slightly unnatural, its presence unsettling even before its true nature was revealed. The Ijurak lured travelers away from safety. Those who followed it were led deeper into the wilderness, farther from camp, until they became lost. In a land where losing one's way could be fatal, this warning mattered deeply. The Ijurak taught caution. It reminded people not to trust appearances alone. Not every figure on the horizon was a friend. Some stories tell of people escaping the Ijurak by turning their clothes inside out or calling out loudly to others. Whether symbolic or literal, these details reinforced alertness and presence of mind. The Ijurak was not meant to be hunted or defeated. It was meant to be recognized and avoided. There were also stories of beings less clearly defined, known broadly as Tornat. Tornat were spirit helpers or forces that existed between the human and unseen worlds. They could guide, protect, or warn. But they could also bring harm if approached without respect. Unlike monsters in other traditions, Tornat were not inherently evil. Their nature depended on relationship. How a person lived mattered. How they treated animals mattered. How they respected taboos mattered. In Inuit belief, danger did not always come from outside. Sometimes it arose from imbalance within. These beings reflected that understanding. They were not punishments sent from above. They were consequences made visible. The appearances of these figures varied from region to region, from family to family. Details shifted, names changed. This flexibility kept the stories alive. They were not fixed myths carved into stone. They were adaptive memories, shaped by landscape and experience. Fear, in these stories, was not overwhelming. It was measured. It sharpened awareness. It encouraged restraint. It reminded people that survival required attentiveness. The Arctic rewarded those who listened. Through these beings, Inuit mythology taught vigilance without panic, respect without obsession. Fear had a place, but it was never allowed to rule. As generations passed, the land changed and the stories shifted slightly, but their purpose remained. They continued to guide behavior quietly, without force or command. In the next chapter, we will turn away from fear and toward endurance, to the stories of survival, adaptation, and how people learn to live in balance with one of the harshest environments on Earth. For now, the warnings linger, not as threats, but as memories shaped into story, carried forward by those who understood the North. In the far North, survival was never guaranteed. The land offered food, shelter, and beauty, but it also demanded attention, patience, and restraint. Those who lived there learned quickly that endurance was not a single act, but a way of being. In Inuit mythology, survival knowledge was not separated from story. It was woven into it. Stories were not told only to remember the past, but to prepare for the future. Through myth, listeners learned how to behave in the world long before they faced its challenges themselves. Many stories speak of long journeys across ice and sea, of hunters traveling far from camp, guided by stars, wind, and memory. These journeys were not heroic in the modern sense. They were careful. Success came not from strength alone, but from judgment. Knowing when to turn back mattered more than reaching a destination. Knowing when to wait mattered more than speed. In these stories, patience was a survival skill. The land itself was a teacher. Ice spoke through sound and movement. Snow revealed wind patterns. Animals signaled changes in weather and season. Those who observed closely lived. Those who ignored signs did not. Inuit myths often describe moments when people survived by listening rather than acting. A hunter waits instead of pursuing prey. A family remains in place instead of traveling during uncertain weather. A camp moves only when the signs align. These moments may seem simple, but in the Arctic, they were the difference between life and death. The stories also taught cooperation. Survival in the North was rarely solitary. People shared food, they shared tools, they shared responsibility. Greed was remembered as dangerous. Those who hoarded food or acted only for themselves often faced misfortune in stories, not because they were punished, but because isolation weakened them. Endurance required community. In many myths, survival depended on helping others, even when resources were scarce. A shared meal meant shared strength. This was not idealism, It was practicality shaped by experience. The Arctic did not allow excess. Everything had a cost. The stories taught that taking more than needed disrupted balance, not only spiritually, but materially. Animals withdrew. Weather turned hostile. Hunger followed. Through repetition, these lessons became instinct. Children grew up hearing the same stories, absorbing their patterns long before they understood their meaning fully. By the time they faced the realities of the land, the lessons were already part of them. Endurance was not framed as triumph. It was framed as continuity. To survive was to maintain balance, to move with the land rather than against it. Inuit myths rarely celebrate conquest. They celebrate adaptation. Those who survived were those who learned when to act, when to wait, and when to let go. This quiet strength runs through Greenlandic mythology. It does not announce itself loudly. It endures. In the next chapter, we will explore how this endurance extended beyond life itself, into death, remembrance, and the ways the past continued to live within the present. For now, the stories remain where they have always been, within the land, within memory, and within the careful rhythm of life in the north. In the old stories of Greenland, death was not an ending. It was a movement. Life did not disappear when the body failed. It changed its place within the world. For the Inuit, death was understood as part of the same cycle that governed animals, seasons, and weather. Nothing truly left the land. Nothing was lost completely. The boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and it required care. When someone died, their presence did not vanish at once. Their spirit lingered close, especially in the places they had lived, traveled, and worked. Because of this, death demanded attention. Rituals were performed not to worship the dead, but to guide them, to help them move safely from one state of being to another. Improper handling of death was believed to disturb balance. The living might experience illness, misfortune, or unrest if the transition was not respected. In Inuit belief, the dead were not distant ancestors locked away in the past. They remained part of the community. One of the most meaningful expressions of this belief was the practice of naming. Children were often given the names of those who had recently died. This was not done as remembrance alone. It was believed that aspects of the deceased lived on through the name. Their qualities, strengths, and presence continued within the child. This practice created continuity. Generations overlapped rather than replaced one another. The past lived quietly within the present. A child was never only themselves, they carried echoes. Because of this, children were sometimes treated with the respect normally given to elders. They were spoken to carefully. They were listened to. The dead were not gone. They were redistributed. In some stories, the souls of the dead traveled to different realms depending on how life had been lived. Those who endured hardship patiently, who followed taboos, and who lived with respect were said to journey to peaceful places. Others wandered, unsettled, until balance was restored. These destinations were not described in detail. They were not meant to be visualized clearly. What mattered was not where the soul went, but how the living behaved in response. Death reinforced responsibility. The way one lived mattered beyond a single lifetime. Grief was understood, but it was not allowed to overwhelm the community. Life in the Arctic demanded continuity. The dead were honored, but the living had to endure. Stories helped hold this balance. They allowed grief to exist without becoming paralyzing. They reminded listeners that loss was part of the same cycle that sustained life. Even animals followed this pattern. When an animal was killed, its spirit was believed to return to the land or sea, ready to be reborn if treated properly. This belief softened death. It transformed it from an ending into a return. The land was a keeper of souls. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was truly gone. Through these beliefs, Inuit mythology created resilience. Death did not sever connection. It strengthened it. The living carried responsibility not only for themselves, but for those who came before and those yet to come. In this way, memory became a form of survival. In the next chapter, we will return to the land itself, to ice, sea, and sky, and explore how Inuit myths understood the Arctic as a living presence rather than an empty wilderness. For now, the voices of the past remain close, woven into names, stories, and quiet remembrance, enduring alongside the living in the north. In the Inuit understanding of the world, the land was never empty. Ice, sea, sky, and stone were not passive backdrops to human life. They were active participants. To live in Greenland was to live in relationship with the land itself. The Arctic was not viewed as a wilderness to be conquered. It was a living presence, capable of generosity, but also capable of withdrawal. The land listened. Ice shifted in response to weather and season. The sea opened and closed its paths. The sky revealed patterns that guided travel and time. Those who paid attention were protected by knowledge. Those who ignored the land's signals placed themselves at risk. In Inuit stories, the land often responds directly to human behavior. When people acted with respect, the land provided. When balance was broken, the land grew silent. This was not punishment, it was consequence. Ice was understood as something that must be read. Its color, texture, and sound all carried meaning. Blue ice spoke differently than white ice. Still ice behaved differently than moving ice. Stories taught these distinctions long before experience demanded them. Children learned through listening, absorbing lessons without instruction. By the time they faced the land alone, the stories had already prepared them. The sea was treated with equal respect. It was both provider and threat. It offered seals, fish, and whales, but it demanded caution in return. In Inuit belief, the sea was alive with awareness. It responded to care, humility, and ritual. Storms were not random. They carried meaning, sometimes warning, sometimes correction. The sky, too, was alive. Stars guided travel and marked time. The moon influenced tides, animals, and human behavior. The aurora was watched carefully. It was beautiful, but it was also powerful. Some stories warned against whistling beneath the northern lights. Others advised children not to stare too long. These were not superstitions meant to frighten. They were reminders that the sky demanded respect. Everything had limits. In Inuit mythology, the land remembers. Events leave impressions. Paths traveled repeatedly become known. Places where deaths occurred are approached carefully. Memory is embedded in geography. Certain locations are treated as quiet places, not because they are forbidden, but because they hold weight. The land carries the past forward. In this way, Inuit myths function as maps, not of territory, but of relationship. They teach where to go, when to wait, and when to turn back. They remind listeners that survival depends not on force, but on awareness. The Arctic does not respond to ambition. it responds to attention. Through story, the land speaks. Through careful living, people answer. In the next chapter, we will explore how these stories changed over time, how contact, migration, and modern pressures reshaped Inuit mythology without erasing it. For now, the land remains what it has always been, alive, observant, and deeply intertwined with those who listen. The world of the Inuit did not remain untouched. Over time, new people arrived in the north. Trade routes shifted. Languages met. Beliefs encountered one another. Contact brought tools, materials, and new ways of seeing the world. It also brought disruption. Yet Inuit mythology did not disappear. It adapted. The stories were never rigid. They had always changed slightly with each telling, shaped by place, family, and experience. This flexibility allowed them to endure. When foreign ideas entered the Arctic, they did not simply replace older beliefs. They existed alongside them. Some stories absorbed new elements, others retreated into quieter spaces, shared only within families or during certain times of year. The core remained: respect for animals, balance with the land, awareness of the unseen, continuity between the living and the dead. These ideas did not vanish when new words were introduced. They continued beneath the surface, guiding behavior even when language shifted. In some cases, old beliefs were spoken of less openly, not because they were forgotten, but because circumstances demanded caution. Oral traditions rely on trust. They survive best where listening is valued. Inuit elders carried this responsibility. They chose when to speak and when to remain silent, which stories could be shared publicly and which required context and care. This selectiveness was itself a form of protection. The myths were not artifacts to be displayed. They were living knowledge. As modern life reached Greenland, new challenges emerged. Technology changed travel. Settlements grew. Daily survival took different forms, but the land remained. Ice still shifted. Weather still demanded respect. Animals still responded to human behavior. The stories continued to make sense. They did not belong to a single era. They belonged to the relationship between people and place. Even today, Inuit mythology is not a closed chapter. It is present in language, in humor, in cautionary advice, and in the way elders speak about the world. Some stories are told fully, others are hinted at. Not everything is meant for everyone. This restraint preserves meaning. The survival of these myths is not accidental. It is the result of careful transmission. Generation after generation, people chose what to carry forward. They remembered what mattered. They let go of what no longer served. In this way, Inuit mythology reflects the same principle it teaches: adaptation without excess, change without forgetting. In the next chapter, we will step back and look at these stories as a whole, what they reveal about memory, survival, and the human need to understand the world through story. For now, the myths remain where they have always been, quietly evolving, deeply rooted, and alive in the north. In the old stories of Greenland, not everything belonged fully to one world. Some beings existed between states, between human and animal, between the living and the unseen, between safety and danger. These beings were not spoken of casually. They appeared in stories when listeners were ready to understand them. In Inuit mythology, creatures were not invented to frighten. They emerged from experience. They gave shape to uncertainty. They marked the boundaries of behavior. They reminded people that the world was not entirely predictable. Many of these beings were described as almost human. They walked upright. They moved with intention. They could be mistaken for people at a distance, but something was always wrong. A movement that felt unnatural, eyes that did not quite focus, silence where there should have been sound. These details mattered. They taught listeners to observe carefully, especially in unfamiliar places. In a land where mistakes were costly, this awareness was essential. Some stories speak of beings that could imitate human form, yet lacked something fundamental: empathy, restraint, or balance. They were reminders that appearance alone could not be trusted. The Arctic required discernment. Other beings were tied closely to specific places. They did not roam freely. They belonged to the ice, the sea, or the edges of known paths. When people spoke of them, they often spoke quietly. These were not figures to challenge or confront. They were presences to acknowledge and avoid. Many of these stories arose from the dangers of the landscape itself: thin ice, sudden storms, isolation. Rather than listing hazards, the stories transformed them into memory. A creature beneath the ice was easier to remember than a warning spoken once. A shape in the distance was more effective than instruction repeated without context. Through these beings, danger gained a face. But the stories did not encourage fear for its own sake. They encouraged respect. Listeners learned when to turn back, when to stay close to others, when to trust their instincts. In some traditions, these beings were said to be former humans, people who had broken taboos, ignored balance, or separated themselves from community. Whether symbolic or literal, the message was consistent. Isolation was dangerous. Disrespect had consequences. The beings between worlds existed as reminders of what happened when balance was lost. They were not villains in a moral sense. They were outcomes. In Inuit storytelling, this distinction matters. The world did not punish out of anger. It responded to imbalance. These beings were the world's response, given form. Their appearances varied. Some families described them one way, others remembered them differently. This variation was not confusion. It was adaptation. The stories changed to match the land, the people, and the time in which they were told. What remained consistent was the feeling they evoked: caution, attention, respect. The beings that walked between worlds were not meant to be catalogued. They were meant to be understood. They lived where certainty ended. As the stories continued to be told, these figures remained at the edges, appearing when needed, fading when not. They were never the center of Inuit mythology, but they were never absent. In the next chapter, we will look more closely at one of the most enduring themes connected to these beings: transformation, and what it meant to cross boundaries that were never meant to be permanent. For now, the world remains layered, and the beings between worlds continue to watch from the quiet spaces in between. In the old stories of Greenland, the boundary between one form and another was never absolute. Humans were not always only human. Animals were not always only animal. There was a time remembered in story when identity was fluid, when shape followed behavior, and when crossing boundaries carried meaning. In Inuit mythology, transformation was not spectacle, it was consequence. Stories of shape-shifting did not exist to amaze, but to explain. They showed what happened when balance was respected or broken. Many tales speak of people who became animals. Sometimes this transformation was chosen. A hunter might follow an animal so closely that the difference between them faded. Over time, the hunter no longer returned. In these stories, becoming an animal was not always a loss. It was a return to the land. Other transformations were not chosen. A person who disrespected animals, ignored taboos, or acted with cruelty might slowly lose their human form. Their behavior changed first. Their appearance followed. This was not punishment imposed from above. It was a natural unfolding. In Inuit belief, identity was shaped by relationship. How one lived determined what one became. Animals, too, were said to transform. Some stories describe animals removing their skins to walk among humans. Seal women, bear men, and other beings crossed between worlds, forming families and teaching lessons. These stories were not romantic fantasies. They carried caution. When humans forgot respect, the transformed beings left. When rules were broken, harmony dissolved. The message was clear. Relationships required balance. Crossing boundaries demanded responsibility. Transformation also appeared in stories of survival. In moments of extreme hardship, people were said to become something else. Not physically, but in spirit. They adapted. They endured. The old stories did not separate inner change from outer form. Who you were on the inside mattered. Some transformations were temporary, others were permanent. Once a boundary was crossed too far, return was not always possible. This theme appears again and again in Inuit mythology. The world allowed movement, but not carelessness. Freedom existed, but it was paired with consequence. These stories taught listeners to consider their actions carefully, not because change was forbidden, but because it was powerful. To change was to risk losing one's place in the world. The Arctic demanded clarity of identity. You had to know who you were, where you belonged, and how you related to everything around you. Transformation myths preserved these lessons. They warned against arrogance. They cautioned against excess. They reminded people that balance was fragile. In later times, as the world changed and outside influences arrived, these stories remained. They adapted in form, but not in meaning. Transformation continued to serve as a reminder that identity is not fixed by birth alone, but shaped through action, respect, and awareness. In the next chapter, we will step back once more to reflect on what these myths reveal about the human need for story and why the old tales of Greenland continue to matter. For now, the forms remain fluid, the boundaries thin, and the old lessons quietly present beneath the ice and sky. The ancient myths of Greenland were never meant to be preserved in books. They were meant to live. They lived in memory, in conversation, in quiet moments shared between generations. They changed slightly each time they were told, shaped by the land, the season, and the listener. This was their strength. In Inuit tradition, truth was not fixed to exact words. It was carried in meaning. A story could shift in detail and still remain true. What mattered was what it taught, what it preserved, and what it protected. These myths endured because they were useful. They taught people how to live in balance with a demanding world. They taught restraint where excess could be fatal. They taught awareness where inattention could cost a life. But beyond survival, the stories offered something deeper. They explained belonging. In a vast and often unforgiving landscape, people needed to know they were not alone. The myths reminded them that the land listened, that animals understood, and that the unseen world responded. Life was relational. Nothing existed in isolation. The stories also softened fear. They did not deny danger, but they made it familiar. By giving shape to uncertainty, they made it possible to live alongside it. Fear became guidance rather than paralysis. In this way, Inuit mythology did not promise control over the world. It offered understanding instead. The world was not something to dominate. It was something to participate in. As time passed and life in Greenland changed, these stories continued to serve a purpose. They adapted to new realities without losing their core. They remained relevant not because they resisted change, but because they understood it. Even today, echoes of these myths remain. They appear in language, in cautionary advice, in humor, and in the way elders speak about the land. They live quietly, often unnoticed by those who are not listening closely, but they are still there. The endurance of these stories speaks to something universal. Across cultures and across time, humans have used myth to make sense of the world around them. But in the Arctic, where life balanced constantly on the edge of survival, myth carried unusual weight. Here, stories were not optional. They were necessary. They carried memory where writing could not. They preserved knowledge where experience alone was not enough. They taught people not only how to survive, but how to remain human while doing so. The old stories of Greenland remind us that wisdom does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it speaks softly, repeating itself patiently until it is understood. In the quiet of the North, these stories continue to wait. They wait for listeners who approach with respect. They wait for those willing to hear without needing to own or control what they learn. They remain not because they are ancient, but because they are still true. And as long as the ice shifts, as long as the land listens, and as long as people seek meaning in story, the old myths of Greenland will endure. In the North, stories were never meant to end sharply. They faded, just as daylight softened into darkness and storms passed into stillness. The old stories of Greenland returned quietly to the land they came from. There was no final lesson spoken aloud, no conclusion declared. Understanding came through listening, not instruction. The Inuit did not gather stories to explain everything. They gathered them to remember how to live within uncertainty. The world was vast, the land was powerful, and human life was small by comparison. But small did not mean insignificant. Each careful action mattered. Each respectful choice mattered. Each story carried weight. Through myth, people learned where they stood in relation to the land, the animals, and the unseen forces around them. They learned when to act, when to wait, and when to remain silent. Silence itself was part of the teaching. In the Arctic, listening was as important as speaking. Those who listened closely survived longer, learned more, and passed on what mattered. The old stories were not held apart from daily life. They lived within it. They surfaced in moments of decision. They guided behavior when no one else was watching. They shaped instincts before reason had time to intervene. Even now, these myths remain. They do not demand attention. They wait. They wait beneath the ice, in the sound of wind moving across snow, in the way the sky shifts without warning. They wait for listeners who approach with patience rather than urgency. What has been shared here is not everything. It was never meant to be. Some stories are told only at certain times. Some are shared only within families. Others are understood rather than spoken. This is part of their strength. Knowledge that is carried carefully lasts longer. As this telling comes to rest, the land remains unchanged. Ice still moves, animals still watch, the sky still turns. The old myths continue, not as relics of the past, but as quiet companions to those willing to listen. And in the stillness that follows, where the voice softens and the story loosens its hold, the North remains, listening, waiting, remembering.